Hello, this is Dr. Garrett Castleberry, Associate Professor and Program Director of Communication, Media, and Ethics at Mid-America Christian University. I'm here to discuss television as part of our communication and cultural change Intro to TV Studies class, COM 4413. It's a little bit of a media history course, a lot of it television history course. We're using television to be able to examine media history and explore the patterns that unfold in television history. But these are the types of patterns and changes that we can lift up and compare to other mass mediums, which we frequently do in anticipation of being able to understand how media works, why it's persuasive, and what role or roles we can play in that. One of the ways we've simplified the complexity of mass media history and television in particular has been to utilize Amanda Lott's and Jonathan Gray's television studies model of studying TV. And that model, as we review in meeting together, is to take into consideration not one aspect of TV, but to approach it from four tiers of emphasis, whether this is for purposes of scholarly inquiry, right, a broader analysis, or even lecture. And so we have been looking at not only texts, but also understanding these texts in conversation with their context, as well as the institutions that produce and create them, as well as the audiences that receive them. And our course has been broken into units that follow a chronological progression, with each unit covering a decade of television history. We have worked through the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, with some time spent talking about television in the 1950s. And we are nearing the close of exploring the 1990s together. We are on the back end of the course for sure. And we're talking about television in the 1990s. This course semester, our 1990s examination, and even some of these happen to coincide with that late fall season. And so we utilized our examination of sitcoms in the 1990s, most recently, to look at some special horror episodes of TV. How do TV comedies tackle holidays such as Halloween? And certainly Halloween's not exclusive to that conversation. And as we attempted to point out, and certainly you can find many examples for yourselves, holidays play an important role in the cyclical nature of TV seasons and TV storytelling. We highlighted how often these are even heightened for those crucial months that are referred to as sweeps months or sweeps periods. These months where they gather data, they being broadcast networks, right, exhibitors, and so on. And compare text, right? Compare the popularity and the audience demographics consuming these shows so that they can set ad revenues for the next quarter to come. And so we come to this place of November, February, and May sweeps, traditionally, historically, as these months that mark and chart which shows will receive the most attention from advertisers, right? Maybe which shows cost the most to advertise on. And I think there's an important lesson there. There's many lessons really, but that's what we've looked at in class most recently. And this week, it's an opportunity to examine the dramas that were produced in the 1990s. We can look at the 1990s really as this last decade of broadcast and network dominance, but also the dominance of sitcoms and dramas as a kind of false dichotomy of genre programming on TV. And it is a false dichotomy because already we've recognized and even taken in many of the other genres of programming that left their mark on TV. TV's earliest years featured the variety show, which could include music, it could include comedy, and certainly the talk show. All three of those sort of subgenres within the variety programming format that have been able to successfully branch out into their own respective genres over time. And in addition, we also looked at alternative programming. In the 1980s, when we were examining that decade, and when we looked at such alt programming strategies as the birth of the music video as a unique format, the after hours type of programming, or even infomercials as a distinct type of mass media strategy. And so we can see these offshoots and developments, and we have talked about such evolutions in television history as the advent and the onset of satellite television, of cable television. And certainly we can look forward and recognize what's coming eventually, and that would be streaming services and the kind of digitization of television. But we will cover that at a later point in time. Right now, we're in the twilight of broadcast TV dominance, and it's appropriate to look at the other side of a coin and examine some of the dramas that emerge in the 1990s. All right. And so one of the things we can consider, and certainly if you're reading and up to date with one of our books in this course, Jason Mattel's Television and American Culture, you'd be familiar with some of the titles that he mentions periodically in that book. And when I say titles, I mean show titles for popular programs during that period. And so in the 1990s, the network drama gets a lot of attention, right? These kinds of programs are attracting relatively healthy audience numbers, and they kind of culminate in awards recognition, at least the best of them, and probably the worst of them, or those that are the least viewed, are going to have shorter shelf lives. That is to say, they'll be canceled early and potentially forgotten. But we have some counter-programming strategies that I think is worth mentioning, and then it will lead into our emphasis for this course in conjunction with the special month in which we're taking in TV samples. But first, let me set up this idea of what the mainstream broadcast networks are looking like in the 1990s. Okay, so as we come into the decade, there are some TV staples that continue with popular strength, right? And when I say staples, I mean the kinds of programming that are part of TV's diet historically. A couple of examples that come to mind: the police procedural, something we still see today with long-running shows like Blue Bloods. Oh my gosh. Or even the Law and Order franchise, right? These kinds of straightforward police shows, law enforcement emphasis. But also we have the medical drama. There are some a couple of noteworthy medical dramas in the years prior, such as Saint Elsewhere, that aired in the 1980s, but 1990s continued this popular trend. By the early part of the decade, we have a big budget approach to the medical drama, and a kind of cinematic style brought in by producer John Wells to the show that you've likely at least heard of, if not seen, ER. All right, and ER was much more of a straightforward medical drama. I think it, at least early seasons, tried to emphasize that procedural medical aspect of the show, a kind of grim and gritty realism over, let's say, like character development and that kind of thing. Although I would suggest, and I think it's evident over time, there was a balancing out, right, of the melodrama aspects, because quite frankly, this was a show in ER that eventually kind of had to turn over its cast of characters because they were either out kind of naturally outgrowing their roles, right, seeking diversity as a thespian, or perhaps outgrowing, right, the affordability of them, including one noteworthy name, George Clooney, right, who had kind of transcended that text and was ready to make that leap into film. And in fact, the last couple of seasons that he was a part of the show, he was working like 365, right, back and forth, kind of transitioning into more of that film star that I think a lot of audiences think of today. So ER was a text that lasted a long time. It's probably familiar to you because it was on television for so long. And it was interesting because it's still a show that practices a lot of TV things. And what do I mean by TV things? Just as we looked at some special Halloween episodes in our most recent times together, ER was the kind of show that was always willing to practice gimmick episodes, right? Experiment with what we consider TV form. Two examples come to mind in ER's run. One was if I remember, whether or not it was black and white, what I do remember is there was a documentary style episode of ER that was kind of approaching it as if it was a pre-produced, right, kind of take of, right? So it was a bit of a breaking the fourth wall to kind of let the audience know a production is being made about this fictitious place as if it's a real place. Well, that format should feel familiar to us because a couple of years later, it's done in a satirical manner for The Office, of course. But ER, I can also recall their willingness to experiment with a live episode of TV, which is very unique for programs that typically have a multi-camera approach. They're shot almost like film in certain ways. And there would most definitely be multiple takes of things, but this was a very unique challenge because how do you have these transitions and what do you do with the cameras and how do you position characters and how does everything happen on time in a program that facilitates a lot of action, right? A lot of coordination in ER. And so there was a show that did a lot of gimmicks. Speaking of gimmicks, another program I've talked about before would be NYPD Blue. That's a police procedural, but had a rich amount of character development. It was one of the first programs to carry a TVMA rating, or even a TV 14 rating when this TV rating system came about. In fact, NYPD Blue was among the types of shows that kind of thrust forward the need for a TV rating system. And NYPD Blue was notorious for kind of pushing the boundaries with the adult language that they included, and occasionally a little bit of that kind of like titillation of the audience with some like bare bottom, right, partial nudities, just kind of a bizarre practice in retrospect, but at the time it was very intentionally like seeking an audience, but trying to be transgressive in certain ways. And it was definitely for 90s standards succeeding, and for broadcast network standards succeeding. ER aired on NBC while NYPD Blue aired on ABC. We see these competing tones and trends. Meanwhile, over on CBS, that other broadcast network, you had shows like Picket Fences, which was a kind of small town mixture of, I believe it's a David E. Kelly type of product, a famous TV writer, TV producer in his own right, who would later develop ABC's The Practice, which then spun off into Boston Legal. Both of those ran for a number of years, and he's been involved in, he continues to actually stay active in television. In more recent years, he's been a part of some HBO series. So there is a lineage of once you get involved in television, you can make not only a healthy living being a successful TV writer or producer, but there is a longevity of career if you get to know the right people or are able to at least hit it big with one or more series. I mentioned ER, the producer John Wells, or producer kind of that helps develop it. He would go on to produce a show that was even more of a, we call a critical darling and awards winner. It's perhaps a series we may sample as we talk about the bridge between the 1990s and the 2000s, the new century, the new millennium, and that show being The West Wing. All right, and so there are certain series that we'll really get into in the coming weeks that take us into a new frontier of television programming, into the hyper modern era that we find ourselves in now, or perhaps at the tail end of what FX President John Landgraf has titled the era of peak TV. But back in the 1990s, these broadcast networks were putting out a lot of just staple food shows, right? Doctor shows, lawyer shows, Law and Order over on NBC, right? I mentioned some variations, but the original Law and Order, and then eventually SVU, right? These programs are running on TV all at the same time, right? On weeknights and maybe Sunday nights as well. And let's not forget, by the 1980s, we have the emergence of a fourth network, Fox. And we've talked about how Fox was all about counter programming, right? They were trying to speak to different groups, whether it was different demographics, maybe marginalized demographics of viewers, but they were also skewing young. They were aiming for younger audiences, and they certainly had some experimental shows and programs. Cops is an example that comes to mind. One of the originators of what we consider reality television, but also a kind of docudrama in a way. Very much shot in that first-person live footage. If you've ever seen an episode, it just got canceled in 2020. So that's a program that's had as long a shelf life as you could possibly have on television. But you have so in this primetime era, you have shows like that. We talked about the irreverence of maybe sitcoms like Married with Children or The Simpsons as this kind of a nuclear family that's also an anti-nuclear family at the same time. They're transgressive in certain ways because they're not perfect. They're not only imperfect, they're irreverent, right? They kind of thwart those traditional values of the American family, and for that reason, they would often be the target, right, of criticism from conservative groups for portraying and potentially corrupting audiences with their storytelling stylistics. And Fox, because they had the benefit of being able to gamble with their programming and kind of play with the marginal audience, this was one of the only networks that was willing to invest in genre programming. And that might be a confusing term because we talk about genre a lot in our media studies tier of the communication degree. But when we say genre programming, we mean like genres outside the traditional molds, right? That are quote unquote more realistic than others. In the 1980s into the 90s, a genre like science fiction, for example, would often be exclusive to syndication. You might find it, Star Trek The Next Generation is a good example. Star Trek The Next Generation ran in syndication, a term we've talked about several times in the class, meaning it's kind of bought and sold and airing at different times in different regions, in different according to different affiliates' needs. And so Star Trek The Next Generation is airing into the early 90s and even past its end date. Then there are spin-offs, Deep Space Nine, and then Voyager after that, and other syndicated programs that we could call genre shows would include some imports, actually. Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, featuring Kevin Sorbo, right? Who you maybe affiliate with certain type of direct-to-video market type of programming these days. Maybe he's always been affiliated with maybe direct market type programming. But Xena, Warrior Princess, is another cult show that was like in that Hercules universe and had that kind of rabid fan following. But all these kinds of texts, these like they're delving into genre, right? Fantasy, science fiction, and so on. And so their natural fitting places in the margins, kind of off to the side. And their production values, I mean, they're doing a lot with a little, let's put it that way. But a network like Fox is willing to roll the dice. They're willing to gamble a little bit. And so in a setup to our intended text for this week, Fox launches a program co-created by Chris Carter and another name we have heard of at the beginning of this unit, Mark Frost. Mark Frost was the co-creator of Twin Peaks with David Lynch, and we examined parts of that pilot during our pilot week as we emphasized the role of pilots and perhaps what many regard as the greatest pilot of all time in Twin Peaks as we transition from the 80s to the 90s. But by this point in time, Twin Peaks is dead and buried. And the X-Files is this project that emerges out of the creative brain trust of Chris Carter and writers like Mark Frost. It actually houses a stable of TV writers that would grow into their own much later on, right? And names that like Vince. Vince. Oh my goodness, right? Drawing a blank because I'm thinking of someone else, but the creator of Breaking Bad and so many other excellent programs. Anyway, X-Files is a show that is playing with conspiracy and perhaps a mistrust or distrust of government agencies at a time when we actually have a lot of political stability. And this is an interesting note about the difference between a text and its context, or rather how they work in conversation. Is often we find pleasureful and fanciful items that are antithetical to where we are at in time. And a counter example would be at a time where there was heavy real life mistrust with the government. Certain shows didn't work so well to promote a more cynical worldview in the later 2000s. I'll put a pin in that, and perhaps we'll come back to it later. Vince Gilligan. I'm still slapping myself over that one. But in the X-Files, you have a pair of government agents, Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, that are put together. One's more of a conspiracy theorist, the other a scientist. So you have your logical and your emotionally driven characters. And they're sort of opposites, right? Keeping each other in balance, a yin and a yang force. And they're tasked with basically exploring either cold cases and or events, basically closing the books or maybe opening new ones that could solve the conversations around the unknown mysteries in the U.S., right, in greater region. This was a show that kind of started quietly, but became a huge hit relatively early on. So much so it was moved away from what I believe it began on Friday nights, which is known as like the grave site of where TV programming would exist, and it was moved into many other prominent primetime slots. I think at its peak it was airing on Sunday evenings. And at its height, the X-Files was a top 3, top 5 show on TV. It's a kind of a murder of the week type of not just science fiction, but horror science fiction. And I think it blended both well. I think that was part of its popular appeal, was the genre mixing. But also, in addition to blending genres like horror and science fiction, which naturally go together quite often, it was also blending television formats. Its appeal initially was that it had what we call episodic storytelling, meaning self-contained stories that would kind of stand alone and thus make sense in reruns or to see what we call also repeats when something would re-air later, right? And all of this, of course, is before the dawn of streaming by a lot. And so The X-Files was able to gather a lot of cult appeal at first, but what became mainstream appeal eventually. And part of that draw, but also perhaps its death knell ultimately, was it also had a kind of growing mythology. A mythology within its own, fictional universe about certain story threads and character developments that would thread in to future storylines, right? And certain questions that not only characters but also viewers sought to have answered. And the trouble for any TV writer is to be able to balance that episodic storytelling with what I'm describing as serialized storytelling, right? Another favorite term of one of our authors, Jason Mattel. And so serialized storytelling is coming into vogue, right? That is to say, it's having its moment. And that's important in the history of television because it's going to be a standard bearer for the future of where TV goes. And arguably, outside of comedy, our modern tastes and standards in the 21st century hinge on those what we call binge-worthy qualities now. And those binge-worthy qualities have to do with the kind of tight-knit storytelling, or long-form storytelling is a better phrase, that rewards prolonged investment in a text. And so the X-Files experimented more and more over time with that, creating this larger kind of alien conspiracies that were interwoven with government conspiracies. And really, what is this doing? It's actually a throwback to themes we've covered before. Cold War paranoia and the conspiracies, and how that even influenced terms that we use in television history, like the nuclear family, right? And so we can see television history wrapping back around itself again through a text like the X-Files. And it ran throughout the 1990s. It culminated in a feature film. That was a hit, a blockbuster, right? If we can use that term. Around 1998, if I'm remembering correctly. And so that was about peak X-Files in the US, and really the seasons after that kind of got convoluted, and you have the old issues of like cast members coming and going. And so this is one of the unique takeaways about television is how do you balance all of these factors, and when is it time to say goodbye? And that's a nice sideways segue into talking about the other text we're interested in examining this week. That's also a bit of genre programming, that's also coming out in the margins, but it's not quite coming from syndication like a Star Trek, like a Hercules or Xena. But it's coming from what emerged in the late 90s, the mid-late 90s, which was two eager to be broadcast network extensions in UPN, right, and the WB, that is to say Warner Brothers, right? So there was these two competing networks, the WB and UPN. They both wanted to be the new Fox, right? They saw the success model of Fox, they wanted to follow through. And actually, by the time Star Trek's spinoffs got to Voyager, and then one after that was a prequel, Enterprise, they both aired on these new small networks, right? That kind of needed nurturing, and when I say nurturing, they need to find their identity as a network, and they need to find programming that they can invest in, and then audiences can invest in. And the WB really struck it big first, and I say big like little big, right? With a show in 1997. So if the X-Files was coming around and huge in the early 90s through the mid to late 90s, we really get a sense of genre swinging going on in the late 90s with the WB and this little text, this little engine that could, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. All right, and so Buffy the Vampire Slayer was originally conceived as a film. It was a film that came out in the early '90s. A huge miss, right? Just an absolute flop. But perhaps had a kernel of a premise, right? Or at least the creative team had enough of a pitch in them to kind of get this thing off the ground. And so a really talented writing team led by Joss Whedon, but certainly not exclusive to him, including Marty Noxon and many others that would go on to just develop into a tree of successful careers, emerged with this little cult show that could in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. This show aired for 7 seasons. However, it aired for 5 seasons on the WB. And it was actually canceled, kind of both in some ways, in a bit of a mixed history. And there's plenty of scholarship on this show. Let me just leave it at that. But not before it had already created its own spinoff, Angel, by the end of its 3rd season. So here's a show that 3 seasons deep organically produces a spinoff. Both shows are kind of existing parallel in tandem, not unlike you think about the CW's programming now with like The Flash and Green Arrow and Supergirl and these shows like crossing over. This was going on then, but it was more. Wasn't the first time that had been done in television, but it certainly felt innovative, and the show was written with such a fresh touch. The writers had such a voice for kind of 90s speak, early 2000s speak, and sometimes it was their own kind of just almost SoCal slang, right? That it's like a writer that's a confident writer's voice, but it's not really how we talk, but it's so clever enough that we're buying in because we appreciate the freshness of it. Not unlike Gilmore Girls, another successful show from these smaller networks, right? A show that cultivates a loyal fan base. And I think that's a key to connecting both of these texts, other than their genre outlook, is Buffy would benefit from this cult following that was willing to follow it. Even to its canceled grave after 5 seasons, where it was then resurrected, pun intended, to the other network. All right, so it jumped from the WB to UPN, where it would finish out a 6th and 7th season. But by that point, we're into the 2000s, so we can see that transition happening as we move into one of our final units in this course. And that's what makes it such a fun text to explore, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but also because it's kind of in conversation with the X-Files. It's adapting ideas that made the X-Files successful in its formula, but also being its own thing. It's very much a coming of age dramedy, right? Whereas the X-Files kind of combined sci-fi and horror, right, and conspiracy with kind of government agency. And so these shows are doing this genre mixing, and that's very much at the front of where we're looking for programming these days. That's absolutely at the heart of what makes television sing and pop in the 21st century is this clever genre mixing. It's the search for how we can intertwine formulas. And that was working for both of these series in the 1990s, which is why we highlight them on this, the eve of the edge of October, right? We're upon a full moon. Halloween is nigh, and so it only makes sense that we look at a pair of quasi to outright supernatural television texts that will close out our unit on 1990s television and media history for COM 4413. Communication and cultural change. Grab a bag of popcorn, get yourself a beverage, and let's sink our teeth into some conspiracy and horror with this pair of programs. Thank you for listening.